Hello and welcome to the final speaker for the spring for the Criminology Forum, which is a joint effort between the Department of Sociology and Criminology and the Criminal Justice Research Center.
When she stops sharing the screen, then the camera will come on.
Oh, I think it's on now. I can see it.
Without the screen.
I mean, I can see it. If you want, I can stop sharing, but we are on camera.
Okay.
What would you prefer?
Stop sharing for just a moment so that you can introduce and then.
Do I start over or do I pick up where I left off?
It's, yeah, I see. Right. Go ahead. And yes, start over.
Okay.
I think we have to center ourselves. So let's, here, I'll stand here.
Hello and welcome to our final speaker of the spring series of the Criminology Forum. It's a joint effort between the Department of Sociology and Criminology and the Criminal Justice Research Center. We are very honored today to have with us today Dr. Colleen Berryessa. She's an assistant professor
Yes.
at Rutgers,
Yes.
which I can't believe because I
will have tenure in July, but
going
yes.
through her vita, she has published over 60 articles, a book, multiple book articles. She has my glasses on for some of this. I can't read my own writing. She's received the Young Scholar Award from ASC, which we're all familiar with. She's won their experimental division, Young Scholar Award. She's also most recently won, you're gonna help me with this, the Celine Shaw Award for Early Career Excellence in Psychology.
In law, yeah.
In law. So she's not only is she publishing greatly, she's being recognized in the field, won multiple awards. A little bit of background. She received her BA from Harvard in government and mind and brain and behavior. And she also received her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And we are very honored to have her with us today as our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yours.
And now I will share my screen.
And I forgot to mention your research interest, but I'm pretty sure you'll do that.
I can do that. Yes. I will take over. All right. Let me go back. That should go away. Okay. So hi, thank you so much for having me. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper that I published a couple of years ago. It's been one of my favorites in the last couple of years, and so that's the reason why I decided to present it today in the Journal of Social Issues, where we're going to talk about remorse bias, and specifically for probation officers, although I am doing a similar sample right now with judges that we can talk about at the end. And how this is something that might arise in the sentencing process for defendants who are being sentenced for violent offenses. So let me talk a little bit about my work. So in general, my work looks at how psychological processes and social contexts practically and philosophically influence sentencing. I also look at kind of punishment more broadly defined. So any sort of kind of way that we think about the criminal justice system more strictly or punitively treating individuals through different other types of court processes. So largely mostly within courts, but also outside of that as well. But most of this has been related to sentencing. And so I've done this in kind of two main areas. The first is the discretion of legal decision makers in decision making during sentencing. So I've done a lot of qualitative studies with judges. I've done several judge studies that involve juvenile populations or judges that sit on juvenile courts. I have 3 judge studies that are currently ongoing. One that I'll talk about at the end related to remorse. One that I'm currently doing on honesty and how judges think about honesty in sentencing proceedings, and if they view it as a kind of communicative process. And that's a comparative study with a sample of US and then also Australian judges. And then I also have been interested in other types of legal actors. So I've done interviews with defense attorneys, with expert witnesses, with probation officers, who's what we're going to be talking about today. Most of this kind of area has focused on qualitative work and talking to legal actors using semi-structured interviews. The second is how the public considers and supports sentencing. and how factors, again, related to psychology and kind of social context affect how they view the system should be used, how forms of punishment should be administered. And a lot of this is related to using experimental methods and how they think about how characteristics of specific defendants and how these types of characteristics might lead to stigma or labeling and usually kind of more punitive support. So I've done a variety of experimental work in this area, which I'm happy to talk about if people are interested in. But I think I'll just jump in and we can talk about it afterwards if people have specific questions. So today we're going to talk about remorse. So remorse is something that probably everyone in some shape or form, regardless if you study the criminal justice system, has some experience with. All of these pictures here are kind of represent the feelings and emotions that many of you probably have either experienced yourself or viewed in others when someone has made a bad decision and they feel badly for what they've done. So you see a lot of, affective expressions here related to crying, to facial expressions. You see body language that's hunched over, hands covering the face. A lot of different types of emotions related to grief, to regret. And this is, again, something that isn't just criminal justice context. Everyone's made a bad decision. Everyone's felt bad when they've made those bad decisions. Even small children show these types of behaviors when they are remorseful for committing an act that they shouldn't have or doing something bad that they shouldn't have. And so these are the types of expressions, again, that we're used to, we're common. And even if I hadn't told you that we're talking about remorse today, you could have gathered potentially by looking at some of these pictures that that might be a concept that we are talking about, or that at least some of the emotions that are related to remorse are going to be the things that we're talking about. So those are nonverbal displays. So those affective, emotional expressions, body language displays. And then you also have verbal displays. So these are things like apologies, saying that you're sorry, showing contrition. And then you also have other types of nonverbal displays that aren't necessarily body language or emotion related. Things like paying restitution, paying somebody back after you've destroyed their stereo, something like that. So when we think about these displays of remorse, we think about them as communicating really kind of distressing emotions, things, as I mentioned before, like grief, contrition. And this comes from the acceptance of a person's responsibility for an act of harm against another person. And it's this idea that when a person shows remorse and shows that they are responsible for this bad thing that they've done, that they're a better person, a good person. It may show positive character traits. And again, this is something that you probably, again, in kind of normal social communication can recognize and agree with. In the criminal justice system, it's the same thing. Remorse is supposed to, or believed to convey that a person might have the potential for not continuing that behavior, but then also that this person has good character, that this is something that we should take into recognition when we are considering their bad behavior and what we should do with their outcomes. So there are a lot of factors that influence character assessments of defendants that we could talk about for the entire presentation here. But remorse has been found to be one of the things that is very impactful. Remorse is thought to be important for decision makers, and this can be, again, across the board when it comes to making decisions in criminal justice contexts, and especially when evaluating, again, this relationship between character and offending. Is this person have the potential for rehabilitation? Is this person going to recidivate? What is this person going to be like moving forward? Should this be a person that we consider these characteristics when we think about his outcomes? And during the sentencing process, this is also very important, obviously. There's a kind of a bunch of really interesting work on judges and remorse, although there's not a ton and there needs to be more for sure. But the sentencing process is interesting just because it obviously involves interactions of defendants and a lot of legal actors, but judges are not really the ones who are actually interacting with defendants kind of in the same way that other legal actors might. They don't get a lot of necessary exposure in the same type of way and for the same amount of time. And so probation officers are an interesting group where they do have more exposure to defendants than judges do most of the time. And probation officers who are tasked with writing pre-sentencing reports or PSIs, and there's a variety of ways in which they're defined, and they look a little bit different and have different ways in which they're created depending on the jurisdiction. But what probation officers do is that they create these pre-sentencing reports and recommendations through meetings with their clients, so with people in this case that are going to be sentenced. And during that process, they meet with them. They also evaluate their cases. They look at their legal background, and they also look at extra legal and other types of social information as well. And they use all of these as well as other instruments that might be provided to them to think about the recommendations for sentencing and talk about to the court what types of factors that should be considered and ultimately how this should potentially impact sentencing severity. And so remorse is one thing that, again, depending on the structure of the pre-sentencing report, it might be more influential than in other types. But there are, a lot of kind of formattings of these reports that do allow for these narratives or allow for some of this remorse information to bleed into the information that is communicated to a judge and to the court more generally for sentencing. And so in this context, remorse is something that a probation officer is going to gather through their interactions, through the information and background that they are gathering, both in the case file and also in those one-on-one meetings that they're going to be having before sentencing. But the issue is that assessing remorse, and again, this is not just for probation officers in this context, but just generally in life, is subjective. It's not something that is a trained art. No one has ever sat anyone down and said, this is how you assess a person's remorse objectively. And if you follow this, decision tree 100% of the time, you will know how remorseful this person is down to the percentage. There's no actual objective way of assessing another person's remorse. And assessing that remorse and that process of assessing remorse is very subjective. And it offers a lot of opportunities for bias, particularly, again, in these interactions between the assessor and then the assessee, the person that is showing the remorse. And so there's a lot of research and a lot of other types of work that have been done that talk about how legal decision makers use prior knowledge and stereotypes and a bunch of different kind of prior information to be able to make assessments about defendants that they meet with. And there's a lot to suggest that this also extends to remorse assessments as well. So the idea of filtering the remorse assessment that a probation officer or other legal actor might be doing through that prior experience, through biased expectations of what they're expecting to see a person showing, if those behaviors, remorse behaviors, fall short of what they might expect, then that may mean that because they don't live up to those qualities or live up to that expectation, then it may mean that there are feelings or doubts that person's remorse exists, or that it's genuine, or that it's enough. So it's this idea of filtering remorse through these biased expectations of whether a defendant is showing genuine remorse or even whether or not he's capable of remorse. And this is especially difficult for defendants who have committed violence, who are being sentenced for violence. And this is largely because there's a lot of research about kind of this implicit assumption or association between violence and certain characteristics. And this might really kind of intensify the difficulty that courts and legal actors already have in evaluating defendants' expressions of remorse. Because there is such limited time and information in activating, and this activates implicit bias in associating particular characteristics with violence, it means that the limited amount of time in which this interaction occurs may lead a person to, again, make these prejudgments based on this person having a characteristic that is stereotypically associated with violence or the potential for violence. And so there's a lot of research to suggest that, race, gender, criminal record, gang affiliation, mental illness, I could have included a lot more here on the slides, are the types of qualities that are somewhat implicitly associated with violence. And again, individuals and defendants who have these characteristics, it might be more likely that the difficulties that arise related to remorse are amplified in their specific circumstances. So because we know that remorse stands in or is used in these character assessments, that means that because they're used, the remorse is used to assess character, and that it's also used in this case to really be factored into the sentencing context, remorse can kind of spiral into this kind of, these assessments can spiral into basically reaffirming errors, where cognitive errors can be made based on these biases associating characteristics with violence, and then lead to inaccurate remorse assessments, which lead to inaccurate or biased sentencing recommendations. And so this has been thought to result in a phenomenon called remorse bias. It's this idea of legal actors being biased in their remorse assessments. And that these people might exhibit it when making recommendations in sentencing, and that it could have these biasing effect on defendants' outcomes. And so for remorse bias, and the way that it's been talked kind of theoretically in the literature, it's kind of been thought of as being related to kind of two different psychological mechanisms, although until I had done the study, hadn't been necessarily tested. But there were two types of kind of psychological mechanisms that are really well known in social cognition, that might kind of be at the root of remorse bias and lead to this disregard of people's remorse during sentencing recommendations. And the first is fundamental attribution error. And again, this is super common if you've taken a psychology class or read some psychology literature. You might have heard of the fundamental attribution error. And so what this is it starts off with self-bias. So we ourselves don't like to think of ourselves as being bad people, that our bad behavior comes from bad places, or who we are as people. So when we commit an act of violence, or when we commit a bad act, we like to think that what happened was a mistake. It wasn't who I am, it's just a bad decision that I made. And so we accredit our own errors often to situational external factors like a mistake, so having a bad day, I had peer pressure, whatever it might be, instead of internal character-related or personality characteristics. However, we often don't give other people the benefit of the doubt that much, in the sense that we often view the errors of others more likely to be from these unchanging internal factors. Fundamental attribution error extends the self-bias that we feel about our own mistakes to people that we identify with. So people who are in our own social groups, those who have traits that look very similar to ours, people who we view as being, again, similar or kind of being as a part of our community, people we can understand because we share the same characteristics. And so what that means is that people who we view like us or having characteristics like us, we're more likely to attribute their errors to mistakes, to situational or external factors, and people who are not like us, who we view as having qualities or having experiences that are not like us, to those internal unchanging factors like personality and character. And so what this means is that probation officers who might view a defendant outside of their social groups may view that person as not having a similar background or not having similar characteristics as them. They may be more likely to view their bad behavior, the violence that they've committed to make them end up in the criminal justice system, to inherent characteristics, so to personality factors or internal factors, rather than to mistakes. And because of that, they may view that any remorse assessments that they're doing are disingenuous. They may view that since this is coming from an internal place, the remorse is less helpful. It is less palpable because it's coming from these unchanging factors that are internal. The other factor, social cognitive factor that remorse bias is thought to stem from is outgroup empathy. So everyone knows what empathy is. Again, it's a common human thing. You appreciate another person's thoughts and feelings. And when you empathize with another person, you're reading that person's emotional expressions and feeling how they're feeling in a communicative way. And so empathy is really important in remorse, and it affects evaluations of another person's remorse because it allows us to understand that person's kind of inner world. We understand how that person feels. And so once we feel and see their remorse, we can understand how they're feeling, and it allows us to identify that person is, that we believe showing kind of genuine contrition for what they're doing. It also is true that we are much more likely to empathize with people who are like us. So similar to the fundamental attribution error, where we are looking at people who we think have similar characteristics or share similar backgrounds. Same thing with outgroup empathy. We are much more likely to be able to empathize, read the empathy, read the inner worlds of a person who we recognize as being someone like us. And for people that we don't recognize as being like us or having dissimilar characteristics, this process is much harder. It's much harder to empathize with that person. And because of that, dissimilarity can impede forgiveness, which is one of my favorite kind of quotations here. It means that it can be harder to recognize that remorse instinctually or feel it in the way that you would with someone who has similar characteristics to you. And that would affect your ability to empathize with that person. And then coincidentally, and kind of moving forward into being able to feel the remorse. So probation officers may not be able to effectively empathize with a defendant outside of their social groups or understanding because they can't feel their remorse in the same way that they would to be with someone who has similar characteristics, meaning that they're less able to relate and read that person's remorse. And it may mean that they discount any sort of emotional content or be more likely to at least partially discount that content of a person's remorse because they don't read it in the same way because they have these dissimilar characteristics. So thinking about these two kind of social cognitive processes, this study is an empirical study to look to see how implicit social cognition may affect how probation officers evaluate displays of remorse during sentencing in cases involving defendants charged with violence. And so I interviewed a large sample of probation officers, and I developed a qualitative model that illuminates a process by which officers exhibit remorse bias, or this idea of remorse bias, towards defendants who have very specific social characteristics that are implicitly associated with violence, and how this kind of process of remorse bias can negatively influence how they recommend and portray information during the sentencing process about remorse and character for these defendants. So I interviewed 151 probation officers. I was very lucky. This was over the phone, but I finished in February of 2020. Otherwise, I never, ever would have gotten anyone on the phone ever again. And so I did there were semi-structured interviews. I did not mean to get 151. I was looking for a smaller sample because usually in qualitative research, you don't get that many people to participate, but also you don't need that many. But I got an overwhelming number of people that were interested by using the American Probation and Parole Association's email newsletter. And I felt like I wanted to interview anyone who was interested. So I got a lot of really great participation, which is great, across 27 states and DC. I interviewed people on the phone for 30 to 45 minutes. And I created a interview protocol and that was based around questions for qualitative model development. And if you're interested, this is all attached to the published article if you want to see my interview protocol. And then I used a constant comparative grounded theory analysis that was adapted. And I and myself used coded random excerpts from the interviews, and we found high iterator reliability. And then the demographics, again, we have people from 27 states and DC. There's more women than men. Happy to provide those demographics, but they're also available in the paper too, if people are interested. So let's talk a little bit about the results. So what I found was that probation officers, and we'll talk about each of these in different stages, so we don't have to absorb everything that's on the screen right now. Probation officers exhibit remorse bias as a process by linking particular characteristics of defendants that signal the potential for violence. So in this case, violent signals, to implicit assumptions about their remorse displays being disingenuous or not being enough or disregarding them through the two social cognitive processes that I mentioned. So the violent signals and those being present in a defendant's case led to the exhibition of these two social cognitive processes by probation officers, the fundamental attribution error and then outgroup empathy, which together we kind of consider as this process of remorse bias. And then when officers exhibited this process, they appeared more likely to doubt remorse displays of those with particular characteristics. In this case, those who are the defendants who have the violent signals that we'll talk about in a second. And they used these to create negative remorse-based narratives in their pre-sentencing reports, meaning that they would describe implicit violent identities, poor character, negative things about the remorse displays or lack of remorse displays that were provided by defendants, and this bled into more punitive or stringent sentencing recommendations. So what we'll do is we'll talk about each of these kind of in hand. So there were kind of three parts of the process here. So the defendant's violent signals that I observed, which were the qualities, again, that probation officers appeared to implicitly associate with violence, meaning that when they talked about defendants who had these qualities, they were much more likely to view them as being violent. The potential for violence was higher, regardless of kind of any other factors. And so these were things like the violence that they committed. So sex offenses and domestic violence. Domestic violence was probably the number one thing that they talked about, which was something that I was actually quite surprised at. But they viewed domestic violence offenders as being the least remorseful of all the types of people that they've interacted with. Gang affiliation, length and nature of criminal history, mental illness, substance abuse, and then culture and gender. But I'm going to read some quotes now, and then we'll talk about culture and gender in just a second, because they're kind of specific. So talking about some of the violence that they committed. So as I mentioned, sex offenses and domestic violence offenders were the two kind of main areas that were viewed as being kind of especially implicitly associated with violence. One officer said, if I'm supervising an individual who, let's say, sexually assaulted somebody or was part of a domestic violence offense, then on those cases, those more severe cases, I think that if somebody is engaging in violent crime like that, it puts me more on edge because I feel like they may be at a higher risk to reoffend or do it again. Gang affiliation, as I mentioned, there were several officers who had a lot of prior experience with gang-affiliated caseloads. One officer said, I've got clients who you see the same behavior repeatedly without some sort of meaning or purpose, just gang behavior or just gang related. And that makes me more concerned. There's violence, just unthinkable violence, which we see a lot. The length and nature of criminal history. So again, probably not surprising, longer and more serious criminal histories were viewed as a violent signal. It's important to know what the person who has been capable of in the past. If they're a violent offender with a bunch of assault charges, that when you meet them and you talk with them, you have to use the information to stop them because they're going to do it again. And then mental illness and substance abuse. For mental illness, it wasn't that specific mental diagnoses were mentioned. Like people mostly talked about things kind of more generally. Substance abusers were viewed as especially having the potential for violence. One officer said, if you get somebody who is mentally ill, they may not believe what they did was wrong in the first place. And then another officer said, a lot of defendants who we supervise blame it on drugs or alcohol. Some of them will be what I call a frequent flyer, where they know how to play the system and they continue to be violent. And then finally, with gender and culture, these were not across the entirety of the 151 sample. This was specific to either people who had certain types of caseloads or to, in this case, one half. So female officers were much more likely to view maleness or being male and having a client that's male as a violent signal. We didn't see this for male officers and male clients or female officers and female clients. It was only, or even male clients and then male officers and female clients. It was only the female officers responding and talking about their client load and the men in their client load as being a violent signal. So one officer who was discussing her male client, she said, a lot of times men will come in and definitely don't acknowledge any sort of a problem, blaming the arresting officer or something like that. It almost seems like they don't even view some things they have done as criminal and are just super defensive about what happened to them. And I almost wonder if it's like a gender difference. And then for culture, I had some officers who had very large caseloads that in their communities that were very well represented from either particular ethnicity group or a particular country. So I had a couple officers who had large populations of people from specific African countries, or from Guatemala, or from other places, just based on the enclaves in their particular jurisdictions. And so that is when culture really came about. It was with people, it was with officers who had a lot of experience with large caseloads. And so and this wasn't, again, something that was seen from officers who had people from a large variety of backgrounds. It was mostly individuals who had, again, this significant history with one type of caseload, in this case, people stemming from one specific country or ethnic group. And so one officer was a white officer describing that his caseload was largely Hispanic. He stated that culture is one of the things that we're dealing with. A lot of Hispanic guys I have are big macho. They'll come in and they just feel like nothing wrong with what I did and keep doing it. So these were the violence signals that appear to be, again, implicitly associated with violence and the potential for violence, where officers basically view defendants who had these characteristics as being at a high potential for violence, moving forward, kind of regardless of the other factors in their cases. So the second aspect of this model are those social cognitive processes. So for the fundamental attribution error, when officers were, again, talking about these defendants who have these violent signals, they were much more likely to attribute their violence to internal factors, as we were talking about. They talked about having a criminal mentality, and having kind of this fixed internal mindset and belief systems that are unlikely to change moving forward, and that these factors were natural. They were things that were implicit, were there without having to be fostered kind of by outside entities. And then for outgroup empathy, when individuals, again, had these violence signals, officers were much less likely to be able to imagine their inner worlds. They were much more likely to say they had difficulties, or they even would consciously say that they would misread the emotional content of that person's remorse expressions, or the ways in which they were kind of expressing themselves when they were talking about their cases or bad behavior. And they talked about not being able to feel that person's remorse, not being able to feel that he was really sorry by their interactions. So talking a little bit about the criminal mentality, internal factors, as I mentioned, this really came from this idea that it's this kind of implicit mindset that is stemming from these kind of internal places. One officer said, I think if they have a history of criminal activity where they're creating victims, I think that they probably have a very slim to no chance of having any remorse. Violence history, I think, is somewhat reflective of their thinking and who they are. It's not to say that somebody can't change over time, but it's pretty darn rare. And then this again played into this fixed violent belief system and natural factors, meaning, again, these feelings, these thoughts, these kind of fixed mindsets are stemming from natural places, from internal places that are not being fostered by outside or environmental influences. One officer said, I may say, are you remorseful for your actions? Or how do you describe yourself as a person? And they'll say, well, I'm not a violent guy. I'll bring up the facts. If you're not a violent guy, then what happened here? And then they'll say, well, it wasn't really me, but I'll say it is you. And you're not sorry. They don't regret any of their history. And then with outgroup empathy, so not being able to imagine inner world or feeling the remorse of the defendant that they're interacting with. One officer said, you have no idea what's actually true and what's not really with him. He can say one thing and say he feels guilty and cry. And then the next breath out of his mouth is like, well, screw them. You're telling me you're remorseful, but you're still drinking every single day. You're not asking for help. And then that misreading of emotional content of expressions, not being able to recognize remorse cues or the types of body language or other types of displays that we were talking about at the very beginning of the presentation. One officer who, again, who's female, who was talking about her male clients, men just don't seem to have the ability to feel remorse in the way that females do. Females generally are more emotional and they can express. When they have remorse, and they'll do it in writing and they'll do it verbally, it's more challenging to get any real remorse or any emotion out of a male offender or believe it's real, even if they do. And then finally, taking these kind of two steps together, this leads to these negative remorse-based narratives in pre-sentencing reports, which again are used kind of for two different objectives. The first is to doubt the remorse displays that they are seeing from people who have these violent signals and in which they are kind of exhibiting these social cognitive processes in their interactions, and then describing these remorse displays as being disingenuous or disregarding them in some capacity. And then using those remorse disregardments or whatever you want to say, the fact that it's not viewed as being real, that then leads into character assessments that paint defendants as having a true implicit violent character, viewing them as inherently dangerous, having that fixed violent thinking that is again unlikely to abate or change with external factors, and the fact that because of these things, moral reform is not going to work. It's not going to be helpful or beneficial, and that this person is somewhat of a lost cause. So one officer thinking about doubting, he talks about doubting remorse displays and viewing them as disingenuous and how this bleeds into his pre-sentencing reports. If it's like a domestic violence case, when I first bring them into my office, I say, look, I'm going to ask you a few questions, get your side of the story, get you out of here. And once I tell them that, I start observing them. I look at the way they sit. I watch their mannerisms, their movements. I do put that in my report for the judge. And I just state during the interview, the defendant said he was sorry, but he really appeared to have the attitude that this process really had no bearing on his life. And I put that into the report just so the judge has a little bit more understanding of what I see, because when they're there before the judge, it's like, Your Honor, I didn't mean to do this. I'm sorry. But I may let the judge know that this person is not remorseful. And I say, maybe judge, you should really throw the book at them. And as I mentioned, attitudes like this then bleed into character assessments, using remorse assessments to make character assessments, and then painting defendants as being true, implicitly violent, and having a true character that is unlikely to be helped moving forward. So a couple quotations here. So one officer said, when I supervise sex offenders, it is mandatory that they take responsibility for their crime, but 99% of these guys don't. They say they're sorry, but they think it's a mutual thing. They blame it on the victim. If I see that, I'm going to tell the judge. One officer said, if people are truly remorseful, that really would be a great predictor for future behavior. But if someone does not show real remorse, your past violence is the true predictor of future behavior. And then another officer said, I think that everybody wants to believe that they would be remorseful for their actions, when in all reality, true remorse is something that they have no concept of, and they can't, and they never will. So thinking about this as, again, this multi-part process leading to these remorse assessments and character assessments that are obviously attuned to punitiveness and attuned to this idea that even remorse that's being shown is not real, and portraying this to the court. This obviously shows us how implicit social cognition can affect probation officers and other legal actors too, and how they think about sentencing recommendations, especially for, in this case, defendants who've committed violence, and why they might discount remorse displays for these specific defendants. And so this helps us to not only get a better idea of kind of what's going on here and some of the processes that could be at hand in influencing things like pre-sentencing reports, and it also shows how they might be misleading. So what are the ways in which pre-sentencing reports might not tell us the whole picture when it comes to remorse assessments? And because individuals who are prone to this violent stereotyping might, again, be implicitly associated with the things that we've talked about today, it can also help us understand better on how these recommendations come forward and how they could have these really negative outcomes for defendants who have these violent signals. And so results suggest that pre-sentencing reports and sentencing practices, we know, can sometimes not necessarily tell the full picture. But in this case, it's kind of a new way of thinking about how they can be used to lead to kind of disproportionate and discriminatory results at sentencing. And that's obviously very important because it's not only something that we haven't known about necessarily, but since we know remorse is important in this process, we need to figure out kind of ways in which we can identify remorse bias, document it, and kind of control the effects, especially as probation officers continue to use these methods when charting kind of into the pre-sentencing report writing process. So some of the implications. So, there's obviously still a lot of mandatory processes that judges and sentencing systems have to adhere to, but there's still a lot of discretion. And there's obviously been more movement towards discretionary processes in more recent years. And we know that in systems where discretionary practices are more likely to be there and also influential, the extra legal factors are going to be at hand in those outcomes. And remorse is one of those extra legal factors, as we've talked about today. And so in the paper, I talk a little bit more about this, although I don't have any really good answers to the questions of how we do this moving forward. But I did talk about some strategies about developing remorse kind of bias countering strategies and how we can consider personal attributes like remorse. Remorse is important. It is something that is important to be weighed, but we have to know how to do it in better ways in order to make it sure that it's actually accurately being used. So we want to be able to find ways where we can still consider it in criminal justice processes, but then also be able to kind of adjust for the negative effects that could come out of it. So this might involve increasing awareness about implicit bias towards remorse displays through training, making it salient during sentencing, and then developing methods for deterring it in pre-sentencing reports. Although these may only go so far, we were kind of talking about this before the presentation. People have to be receptive in order to be able to kind of implement a variety of different debiasing strategies. And if you're not receptive, which a lot of people are not, they don't think that they're biased, or they think that it's something that affects other people and not them, it may mean that those strategies may not be as helpful. So other things like systematic observation and feedback have been helpful for different groups, including for judges. And this might help officers to reflect on remorse bias in kind of different ways and how it can impact their pre-sentencing reports. And then there also should be trainings that help officers to understand that defendants are not going to show remorse in the same way. Defendants come from different cultures. There's going to be a very different way that someone who comes from one country versus another, or comes from one background or another, is going to show remorse. And this also extends to people with different mental health backgrounds. I have another paper that came out of this data about defendants with mental disorders and how people with mental disorders often, whether it be because of the symptomatic presentation of their disorder, but also the medications they take, it can make it look like they're not remorseful or not understanding of their behavior because their affect is changed by their symptoms or by their medication. And since that's something that people look for when they're doing remorse assessments, it's not going to be there if they're looking for it. And so knowing that people with autism or people who are on medications are unable to show those kind of conventional indicators is really important. And this is true, again, for cultures, genders, and people who come from a variety of backgrounds that kind of fit within the violent signals that we were talking about. So it's important for officers to kind of think about remorse differently and how true remorse might look in different populations, rather than kind of automatically going to the conventional understandings of remorse, which is what most of us do kind of when we haven't been taught or haven't really thought about these types of things before. So some other future directions that I'm working on with remorse. So I have a graduate student that is interested in remorse as well. She's working with me on the project with judges that we're in the process of. And so she's interested in thinking about remorse as a double-edged sword emotion. So something that has both the kind of positive and negative effects and how it kind of is communicated differently across participants. I'm also interested in looking to see if remorse bias looks different for nonviolent offenses. Are we seeing different signals? Are we seeing different social cognition and the processes associated with those for offenses that are not like domestic violence or sex offenses? Does it look different for other legal actors? So as I mentioned, we've interviewed about 40 judges right now. So doing a similar project with judges to see, are we seeing, again, it's different social cognitive processes? Are we also seeing kind of just different understandings of remorse or different ways of assessing, especially since they are interacting with defendants in different ways than probation officers are, and often with a lot less time? And then, as I mentioned, I'm doing a project on honesty, and honesty and remorse, there are similarities, but there is a difference between them. And honesty communicates potentially something different than remorse does. And so I'm interested in kind of how these two concepts intersect. And as I mentioned, I'm doing this cross-culturally with a colleague of mine in Australia, where we're interviewing Australian and US judges about honesty and what they think it communicates. And remorse has been a big part of that as well. And that's it. Yes, go for it.
So there's a lot going on here. It's really complicated and interesting. One thing, so I can see that some of the things that as being remorse bias are clearer to see than others.
Yeah.
And so I guess to start, so we're assuming that there's a true amount of remorse expressed by a defendant.
Yeah,
But you don't know that true amount.
true.
And so there's almost kind of the assumption that the probation officers are getting it wrong.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's easy to see, like, okay, when they're indexing their expressions or their assessments of remorse to being Hispanic or
Yes.
being male or something.
Yeah,
Other times, I'm not so sure things like history of violence or when people, when defendants are asked about their behavior, they
Yeah.
blame other people and
Yeah.
so forth. I'm not so sure those are the same kinds of signals as race, gender, and culture.
yeah,
And so, I mean, there are inauthentic expressions of remorse, and
Yeah.
you don't know. I mean, some of these probation officers are actually getting it right,
yeah.
and it's not bias.
No,
What
no,
do you
no.
say to that?
No, and I think that that's a really good point. So I think, so again, we're not talking about specific defendants. We're not talking about. They are talking about their whole experiences. And so in the sense that, again, it's more about their guttural reactions to thinking about who are the people that they don't believe are showing us remorse. And so it's through their experiences and their kind of jumping to this understanding that a history of violence or a lengthy criminal record, which are important indicators and are legal indicators that are obviously used and are important to the sentencing process. It's this jumping to the assumption rather than and there are going to be some cases in which it is going to be helpful. It is going to be used in context to be able to contextualize remorse. It's more as them viewing it as this implicit signal in a vacuum almost, and thinking about immediately, when I see a person who has a gang affiliation, or when I see a person that has X, I automatically think X, and I am more likely to exhibit these social cognitive processes.
Some of the quotes didn't really convey that. It
Yeah.
conveyed them assessing defendants' speech and behaviors and history and saying, well, no, this is a pretty good cue to me that this remorse isn't.
Yeah.
And also weighing, remorse versus potential for future dangerousness.
Yeah.
And saying, well, that outweighs remorse.
No, and it's true. And again, all of these, remorse is helpful, and that's what I was saying at the end. It is important because some of these indicators are going to be accurate. They are going to be able to tell us the story with remorse. And there are a lot more quotations. I've more than you could ever want, I think, in the paper. And so I encourage you to maybe look at other ones, and I maybe have picked ones that are not necessarily portraying the full story that I would like to be telling. But it's more of that guttural reaction. It's more about that instinctive and implicit association that then leads to these later factors. Not saying that they're wrong all the time, but it's this idea that the behaviors are going to be more likely to arise when defendants come from these different backgrounds.
Yeah. And again, I'm not so much talking about cultural background,
Yeah.
but history of violence and when they talked about how defendants reconstructed their criminal behavior and
Yeah.
blamed other people.
Yeah.
That's, I'm not sure that's bias in the same way as the other things are bias.
Okay, no, that's very interesting. Yes, go ahead.
I just sort of building on what Jeff was saying that I'm trying to imagine what how to falsify remorse bias. Like, was there any example of a probation officer who said, I look at every case completely absent any prior knowledge about risk or like what did that look like?
I mean, no one said that they, again, look at these cases in a vacuum. People say that they take all that information, but then they're able to disentangle aspects of that that make their assessments more objective. There were a lot of people here who did not seem to believe that that their remorse assessments could be inaccurate in different ways.
So you
So-
can have examples of people who felt did not have any remorse.
Oh, no, they have it. Everybody has it.
Everybody has it.
Everybody has it because humans do. I mean, it's impossible not to. But there were many people who believed that they do not have issues assessing remorse.
So that's
They
the
take
difference.
these qualities into consideration. And that's the thing is that one of the questions that I asked was about what are the things that you look for? Like, what are the qualities of defendants that you think are important in making resource assessments? And these were the ones that came up. So they have preconceived notions of the types of things that they are interested in or in their past experiences. So they're taking them into account. Often they don't believe that taking this information into account is problematic. And in some cases, it might not be. You can't look at it in a vacuum. This is important contextual information. It's the problem when it trickles into these other types of kind of cascading effects where we're not sure where it might lead to.
So kind of following it, it's like there's a hierarchy of remorse biases.
Sort of, yes, because again, you can think of a defendant that has a lot of these. And that kind of, I look at amplifying effects or anything like that. This wasn't really built to be able to do that. But one could imagine that someone who has many of these violent signals are going to be more likely to be at the mercy of a lot of different factors kind of influencing probation officers. And then even things like having a female officer evaluating a male client, that's like an additional kind of complicating factor. Go ahead.
I really think it's important to bring remorse in, so I think that's great. And I understand how remorse bias comes from psychology, and that's probably why you're using it, but how would you feel about replacing it with remorse discounting? And then unwarranted and warranted discounting?
I think that's a really good point. So yes, I have no evidence here to suggest that it leads to complete eradication of remorse assessments in the sense that someone views every single time that a person is gang affiliated and has a mental illness, that it leads to, 100% of remorse, it being disregarded, or 50%. But one can imagine that whatever assessments they do have are going to be in some way, as you said, discounted. They will be viewed as being less fully remorseful than they would be potentially if they didn't have these qualities. So I think that that's a good way of thinking about it.
Discount it because of a lengthy criminal record. That's scientifically based, right?
Yeah.
There would be reasons to maybe doubt a person's whether they're being genuine, whereas if they use race or gender, then that's inappropriate and unwarranted. And I just wonder if that distinction, we do that with race.
Yeah.
Race differences and various other things.
No, of course. And I think using remorse as a factor in, especially when it comes to things like long criminal history, a legal factor that is well-founded, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it does help us to anticipate recidivism. It's the idea that it being viewed itself without anything beyond it. Not to say that it's not even necessarily accurate in many cases. It's in the context of people viewing it as telling the whole story. In the sense that when a person has a long and lengthy criminal history, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be interested in using that as a factor that they weigh and potentially using to discount. It's the fact that they automatically discount or are more likely to, in a guttural way, think about it as a discount as compared to using it as a factor in the weighing process. So it's more guttural than it is something that shouldn't be taken into account completely. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to ask in your interviews if there are any attributes that cause probation officers to maybe overweigh somebody's remorse or view them as more remorseful than they might otherwise be. It seems like gender might be a particularly they might see females as being more likely to be remorseful. If you're pregnant, if you're a parent, I don't know.
So this is a really good question. So I wouldn't say, and again, this wasn't the focus, so I have more anecdotal than systematic evidence, I would say, in that context. But religion was one thing that people talked about. Religion and remorse have a relationship already, so it's not surprising. So people who have a religious background or strong religious affiliation, that was something that was viewed as being kind of helpful to be able to tell them about that person's character. and their kind of potential for remorse. Being female was something as well that was mentioned, which again makes sense. This idea of being more connected emotionally as a woman and being able to understand and reflect better when you're female. And some of the other ones that kind of, again, were more anecdotal, people talking about individuals who had already reached out to victims, people who have tried to make restitution. I have another paper that also came out of this data that talks about remorse as a therapeutic tool. So I also, again, these were huge. This is a huge amount of data. So I got a lot of really great stuff out of it. But it was basically this idea that remorse acts as a therapeutic process for specific defendants, and kind of behavioral ways of showing that you're sorry were probably the most in that particular analysis. That was the most important thing for probation officers. So saying that you're sorry or crying or doing some other type of display that didn't involve a lot of effort wasn't viewed as being as important. Because that can be something that's faked, or that can be something that is easily done. But when you're even writing a letter, when you are paying someone back or helping your community, or in some way trying to do something through external behaviors that allow for effort to be shown, that was viewed as the kind of most important thing. That and then like religion and other types of things. But that's a little bit more farther down the line because you need more evidence. The more guttural reaction ones that we're talking about here are probably the religiosity and then femaleness. Yes.
POs always give reports to the judges. I should know this, but like, is it?
No, not always.
So is it like, are POs and like the defense attorneys and the prosecutors, are they all weighing in on the same report and then the judge like reflects on which one to believe?
So yeah, I mean, every jurisdiction's a little different. And even, I can't even talk about the kind of content of the reports in a way that's more than just kind of an essence, because each of the jurisdictions use them so differently. So sometimes they are more narrative based, sometimes they're narrative and then they use a scale or like an instrument. Sometimes they're largely instrument based. And there's only a very minor kind of ways in which a narrative can be provided. Most of the officers that I talked to said that they felt that there was a way that they could talk about remorse in these reports in a way that could help. Some are going to be able to include it in a much longer narrative versus others, but there is a way to provide that information. But yeah, it's officers who are doing them and providing them. And that's again through the meetings, going through the background and through the case file. So not done in relation to the attorneys or the judge. It's usually handed to the judge and used during that sentencing process.
Okay, I saw that Holly had her hand up and I think I see three things in chat. Are they questions? Yeah. So Holly, why don't you ask and then we'll move to the online question.
Okay, great. The theoretical model that you, I wonder if it is always necessarily that sequence, and whether maybe probation officers already have decided, right?
Yeah.
And then use remorse as a justification.
Yeah.
For their decisions.
No, and I think it's a good point, and that's why other populations are good to look at. And also, I'd like to be able to study this in a different methodological way to try to kind of figure out and kind of disentangle some of the things that I'm seeing. Because yeah, I mean, some of the other qualitative models I've done in the past, you similarly see either like a signal or something that allows for the processes to basically be triggered, and then that leads to these kind of consequences. So yeah, based on my analysis in this sample, this is the kind of order that I saw, but I would like to see it done in other ways and with other populations and with a different sample of POs as well. Just because I agree, it is complicated and it's unclear if maybe you have some things cycling off of each other in ways where it's not just a one-way kind of phenomenon. So that's a really good point.
Ashley, would you like to move to the online question?
Yeah. So the first one was, there are concerns that bias awareness training is ineffective. Are there specific training methods that you would recommend?
So yeah, so I think, so some of the ones that I talked about in the paper and even the ones that I mentioned here, so feedback, so being observed and having feedback is helpful. that does mean that someone has to be allowed to be observed, and does need to get that feedback and be able to translate that feedback. So it doesn't necessarily always mean that it can be as effective, but it does provide a little less of an opt-in situation, especially if it's something that's being done through maybe a continuing education or something that's more mandatory. I also talk about in some of the other things that I talk about are like what organizations use for debiasing, particularly for populations that they think are going to be as receptive to dealing with them. I talk a lot about those in the paper, so I'm going to have them go to the paper because they're quite complex actually, and they're more related again to kind of what business and corporations have used. But most of them involve people either not having the ability to opt in or being able to get feedback and information and participation in ways that don't involve them directly having to admit that they're biased, which is again something that's really hard for people to do.
So the second one was, it seems that lots of probation officers mention offenders saying, "I'm sorry" as a type of remorse. And you also mentioned that there are a lot of types of remorse, such as out loud crying. Have you ever thought about categorizing remorse into cognitive versus affective groups so that some implicit biases can be grouped into one aspect of remorse?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I think I do think that especially things like out-group empathy might be affected particularly by things like crying or body language, as compared to, or even like timbre of voice, as compared to other types of displays, whether that be behavioral or verbal displays. So yeah, I obviously didn't do that here, but it would be interesting to think about how some of these processes might be either more specific or more likely to show up in contexts where a certain type of display is being shown. And that probably is again going to largely differ based on the defendant and his characteristics. So for example, some of the people that I've talked about, like some of the different violent signals may lead a person to be much more likely to show verbal remorse because they are less likely to show affective remorse. As I mentioned, people with mental illness may not have a normal or neurotypical kind of emotional affect. You might have people from different cultures who believe that crying is not appropriate, regardless of what the background is. And so verbal might be much more important in that context because that's the only way they're going to show remorse. So yeah, I think that's a good point, and might be something to consider moving forward.
All right. Relatedly, would you suggest putting indicators of recidivism on a scale from subjective to objective?
I mean, I don't know, definitely not from this study particularly. There's definitely not enough data to be able to do that. It's also hard to be able to connect people's remorse displays, especially kind of in this way, and then be able to directly connect it to later behavior. Although obviously there are studies that are going to be better able to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think that doing more studies like this at least help us to understand how officers perceive that range that maybe you're describing. Maybe it's not an actual range that you can use as an instrument, but it may be helpful and influential to figure out that officers are viewing certain qualities as more likely to be subjective or objective in their remorse assessments, and why that might be important.
The last one is just a comment. You might want to look at the literature on accounts about the validity of stereotypes and statistical discrimination. Men actually are much more violent than women. And the citation is Scott and Lyman.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, we're over time, so I would like to take a moment to thank Colleen for.
Thank you.